Hi everyone, and welcome back to Signstuck, the postmodern primer based on the webcomic Homestuck. Today we're talking about Frederic Jameson, an American literary critic and political theorist who publishes very expensive books for a Marxist. Jameson argued that the overarching economic system affects a society's cultural and artistic output. Therefore, postmodern art and the underlying emotions and neuroses it wrestles with can be understood as a consequence of a type of capitalism. Today we're going to focus on three main elements of Jameson's critique: depthlessness, historicity and pastiche, and fragmentation. We're also going to look a little bit at his analysis of experimental video. Before we dig in, I want to mention that Jameson didn't think there was a sharp dividing line between modernism and postmodernism, any more than he saw a sharp transition from earlier forms of capitalism. You've probably heard the slogan, "There is no ethical consumption under late capitalism," before, available on a t-shirt in 17 different colors from redbubble.com, and you might have a vague idea of what late capitalism refers to. For Jameson, the important feature was not the decline of heavy manufacturing, also known as post-industrial capitalism, but the rise of giant multinational corporations. In his view, the fact that so many objects and economic forces in our lives come from totally invisible and indecipherably complicated supply chains tied up with these multinationals had a kind of numbing effect. People can't ever really understand the full machinations of this system, or ever really much about it at all. People become more disconnected from a world where they can't describe or affect the system that surrounds them. And this intuition finds its form in postmodern art. In the 80s, when Jameson was writing, computers and computer networks were kind of new and not very well understood, and therefore scary. Jameson saw computer networks frequently popping up in fiction, especially spy thrillers and the emerging genre of cyberpunk, as a sort of collective unconscious expression of what it feels like to be trapped in the equally far-flung and obscure system of capitalism, or as he called it, the impossible totality of the contemporary world system. The metaphor of computers allowed people writing back then to express what Jameson called high-tech paranoia. The circuits and networks of some putative global computer hookup are narratively mobilized, that is, used in stories, by labyrinthine conspiracies of interlocking and competing information agencies in a complexity often beyond the capacity of the normal reading mind. This is definitely a little familiar. Computers and the internet on their own definitely aren't scary to readers of a webcomic. But some of the same anxieties about inescapable systems and unseen forces are definitely important to Homestuck's plot and themes. Spurb and Scrub are video games of unknown and possibly dubious provenance. The alpha copy of Spurb is connected to the Condescension, aka alien fish Hitler. The Trolls copy of Scrub is retrofitted by Solix from something Aradia dug out of the ruins, and it's entangled with Karkat's till-death curse programming. The Trolls are literally named after internet trolls, a pack of strangers inexplicably dedicated to a campaign of harassment. The beta kids start off with no idea who they are or why they're bothering them, and they turn out to be literal aliens with an impossible-to-appease grievance. Once the game is installed, the kids are vulnerable to forces they didn't plan on. Suburb will hack your house. Suburb will hack your parents. Suburb will reshape your planet. And why? To propagate itself. In the language of capitalism, for growth. In the language of Homestuck, it was already here. Just like people are born into capitalist societies and there's no real way to opt out, there's no way to opt out of Suburb either. And both capitalism and Suburb affect not just the lives, but also the minds of people caught up in them. The players scrawl codes on their walls that they aren't aware of and can't even see because of the nebulous pressures of the game. In the same way, according to Jameson, people living under multinational capitalism will express some of the same anxieties and pressures, and those issues will show up in everything from video collage to novels to architecture. Now, that doesn't mean that every piece of art produced under these conditions or in this time period will automatically have the same themes. Not every piece of art will reflect the exact same kind of disconnection or distress. It only means that these economic conditions are going to have a widespread cultural effect. Jameson calls this kind of influence the cultural dominant. So, what do these effects look like? In the intermission, Spade Slick breaks into the vault in Lord English's green felt mansion and finds a barcode scanner. Snowman appears and destroys both versions of the barcode, she shoots through his card of blackjack rules and uses her whip to tear off his arm. Specifically, his left arm. But then, after she locks him in, Slick flips his sprite. Then, he's lost his right arm. Jameson's idea of depthlessness is similar to Baudrillard's simulacrum, which we talked about last episode. Depthlessness means that the surface of the art is all there is, because the art doesn't point to or contain any kind of deeper or inner reality. Jameson describes it as superficiality in the most literal sense, perhaps the supreme formal feature of all the postmodernisms. Looking specifically at Andy Warhol's work, it is as though the external and colored surface of things, debased and contaminated in advance by their assimilation into glossy advertising images, has been stripped away to reveal the deathly black and white substratum that subtends them. Or, in plain English, partly because of the forces of capitalism, this postmodern art is all surface. Now, this doesn't mean that it has no meaning, but that all the meaning it has is wrapped up in its materiality, in its way of being presented, and not just the content that gets presented. Spade Slick, in this sense, is depthless. He has right and left hands. One of them has the barcode, and one of them doesn't. But there is no true, meaningful answer to the question, which hand did Spade Slick lose? Spade Slick is presented as a flash sprite, so the way that his left and right sides work is fundamentally unstable. The only question that makes sense to ask is, how is Spade Slick being rendered in this particular panel? And not only does Spade Slick function in this way, but he actually leverages his depthlessness, the design parameters which are the only singular level of his existence, in order to reach his exile terminal and bring us back into the main story. Another key symptom of postmodernism for Jameson is a loss of historicity. Because we can't comprehend our present, because of the domination of multinational corporations, we've also lost the ability to properly understand our past. Now, a loss of historicity is not the same thing as a loss of history, in the sense of everything being erased or forgotten. Instead, it's about how people relate to, perceive, and represent the past, as a series of disconnected images and fragments, rather than a robust or coherent or textured whole. This manifests in art as pastiche. Pastiche is the use or mimicry of elements from the past without any real sense of their weight, meaning, or original context. Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language. But it is a neutral practice of such mimicry, without any of parody's ulterior motives, amputated of the satiric impulse, devoid of laughter. Obviously, the Striders are very concerned with issues of irony and satire. Obviously, the text of Homestuck is full of references and joking imitations, from Cthulhu to the Wizard of Oz references to Rufio. But I want to look at one very particular quirk of Homestuck's humor that both embodies and engages with Jameson's idea of pastiche, and kind of turns it on its head. And that quirk is the incorrectly attributed quotes. These quotes, scattered throughout the narration, are deliberately and obviously credited to the wrong person. Even when the quote itself is less famous, or the person it's attributed to less absurd, the narration around the quote lets us know that Hussie is screwing around. We can see this most clearly the second time this pattern emerges in the comic. Absence diminishes the little passions and increases great ones, as wind extinguishes candles and fans with fire. Walt Whitman. Yes, you are certain Walt Whitman said that. 100% positive. Of course, just thanks to the overcompensating reassurance, the reader is pretty sure Walt Whitman did not say that. In fact, the quote is from a 17th century French nobleman, François de la Rochefoucauld, and not from the father of free verse. And the commentary about certainty recalls and casts doubt on the previous instance, when a line from Shakespeare's Timon of Athens, "The moon's an errant thief, and her pale fire she snatches from the sun," is attributed to Mark Twain, while the narration says, "You are almost certain Mark Twain said that." The misattributions quickly become absurd. A quote from the Tao Te Ching is placed in the mouth of Oscar Wilde. And the dripping purple prose of Rose's loathing of the rain culminates in the most well-known quote so far, the famous line from T.S. Eliot's poem, The Waste Land. "How you hate this season. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain." American sports legend Charles Barkley. Jameson describes pastiche as a kind of verbal puppet theater, using the words, quirks, and images of the past in a haphazard patchwork way, rather than forging a new or original voice. He writes that pastiche is the imitation of dead styles, speech through all the masks and voices stored up in the imaginary museum of a now global culture. Random cannibalization of all styles of the past. I am completely certain Frederic Jameson said that. He doesn't think this is entirely artistically void. It is not incompatible with a certain humor, nor is it innocent of all passion. High praise indeed. But he worries that modernist styles become postmodern codes. The language of art risks becoming an endless circulation of truncated bits of previous works, stripped of their full effect and unable to produce anything truly substantive, individual, or new. Now, it would be very hard to argue that Homestuck lacks a distinct style, visually, verbally, and structurally. Vivid symbolic color blocking, dynamic emotional movement, long rambling metaphors, acerbic banter, and slow embroidery of details into a seemingly aimless, meandering series of conversations, suddenly punctured and paid off by a burst of frenetic action, are all part of the Homestuck style, and its constant use of references helps build that style. The misattributions are pastiche, in the sense of taking fragments of the past, stripping them of their actual original weight, and scrambling them for Homestuck's own purposes. But Homestuck is aware of this, and it lets readers in on the joke, with a self-deprecating tone that is another earmark of Homestuck's particular style. Which brings us, finally, to fragmentation. Jameson believed that one of the major changes from modernism to postmodernism was a shift in what he called the cultural pathology. Like the cultural dominant, this doesn't have absolute sway in every case. Unlike the cultural dominant, which is a systemic cause, the cultural pathology is one of its effects. The cultural pathology is a specific manifestation of unfulfillment or unease caused by a society's structures, and how that society thinks about its goals and its problems. Under modernism, civil society was obsessed with individual bourgeoisie prosperity. That's what people were encouraged to aspire to. A good job, a nuclear family, a house in the suburbs. Anxiety, alienation, and ennui were major themes in a lot of modernist art because those were the psychological dark side of the modernist ideal, writ large. Those themes resonated with lots of people for whom that standardized life was either inaccessible or completely stifling. They felt that their real inner selves couldn't be expressed under such rigid conditions. But in postmodern culture, Jameson sees alienation becoming less of a concern. Instead, the new cultural pathology is fragmentation. Part of this tied into the popular theoretical idea, which Jameson mostly endorsed, that under the postmodern era, the idea of what a person was had changed. And obviously, even though a human is still a human, that cultural trend affected how people thought of themselves. Just like postmodern art doesn't have a deeper level or a separate inner meaning, the postmodern person, or subject, doesn't have a pure inner self and a separate outer self either. Instead of a divide between a true inside and an outside that can either express or fail to express that truth, who a person is sort of the culmination of all the ways they represent themselves to others. People build themselves out of multiple outsides, multiple surfaces. You are who you act like and who you tell people you are. Are there any usernames that you respond to as strongly as your birth name? I mean, if you're the kind of person who watches Homestuck analysis videos on YouTube, probably yes. What if you do too many other things, performing for too many other people in different contexts, in ways that don't make you happy? You get confusion, self-destruction, and burnout. And the way that struggle gets represented in art is fragmentation. Dirk and the autoresponder are kind of a super literal parable for this. Dirk, as Prince of Heart, is literally prone to fragmentation. Calliope tells us, "A path ruled by the heart aspect can be a journey of a splintered self. That is, the player's being may exhibit the same kind of fragmentation which certain classes could cause in others." And for Dirk, his splinters are all tied up in how he relates to other people. Brain Ghost Dirk exists because of how Jake sees him, and the kind of friend that Jake needs him to be. The autoresponder is a literally digital facade, a front that Dirk creates to deal with other people for him. The autoresponder is an internet avatar on steroids. He's more social than Dirk, more immature than Dirk, and he can be whatever his friends need, from flirt-larping with Roxy to guiding Jane into the medium. You might think, wait a minute, this just sounds like modernism again. There's the fake autoresponder and the real inner Dirk, right? But there are two main problems with this interpretation. First, there's Homestuck's constant motif that multiple identities can be equally valid, even if society, or say the alpha timeline, can only acknowledge one. Dave Sprite struggles with being not real Dave. But he's still very much a real person of his own, with his own role in the story. He ultimately stops worrying about his status compared to real Dave when he merges into Dave Peta Sprite. When Roxy and John come back from the Game Over timeline, the Roxy and John in the Alpha timeline suddenly die, but Jade and Jane mourn them because they were Roxy and John too. Everyone in Homestuck is fragmented. With Dirk, it's just even more obvious. And the second, more subtle problem with imagining the autoresponder as a fake or inauthentic version of real inner Dirk is that there's no actual meaningful way to tell the difference between them. The other alpha kids can eventually tell that it's the autoresponder because he does things like say it seems too much and make bogus calculations, and he has to describe his own function when prompted. But those are all things he does over a chat client. And until the game begins, the other alpha kids also only know who Dirk is because of the things he says over a chat client. Dirk is a splintered soul, and all of his splinters are just ways he represents himself to others. Now, that fragmentation can be deeply unhealthy, out of control, and self-destructive, from the autoresponders controlling schemes to Dirk trying to break the classes in half. Of course, it isn't just the characters who are fragmented. From the acts to the way Homestuck splits itself over multiple timelines and different media, the comic is fragmented too. We're going to look at narrative fragmentation more closely in our next episode. For now, I want to look at the ways that Homestuck does and does not conform to Jameson's idea of how depthlessness and fragmentation can be not just themes of a story, but features of a text. He writes that, if indeed the subject has lost its capacity to organize its past and future into coherent experience, it becomes difficult enough to see how the cultural productions of such a subject could result in anything but heaps of fragments, and in a practice of the randomly heterogeneous and fragmentary and the aleatory. Aleatory, by the way, means depending on luck, such as a dice roll or your audience participation when your audience is kind of weird. In other words, if people can't understand their world because that world is dominated by invisible, inscrutable, and convoluted systems of money and power, then they can't connect to the past or predict the future. And people trying to make art in those circumstances are going to be drawn to structures that are disconnected or governed by chance, in the same way that their lives seem to be. Jameson also thinks that postmodern art uses contrast between its different fragments to create meaning. He approves of this because emphasizing difference is one of the only ways to create meaning, once you no longer have an inner truth to rely on. Now, Jameson is writing before the development of high-bandwidth internet made the full sprawling, cross-linked multimedia madness of Homestuck possible. But he says this about the experimental video art of Nam June Paik: stacked or scattered television screens, positioned at intervals within lush vegetation, or winking down at us from a ceiling of strange new video stars, recapitulate over and over again, prearranged sequences or loops of images. The postmodern viewer is called upon to do the impossible, namely, to see all the screens at once, in their radical and random difference. Prearranged sequences, looping over and over, distinguished by small differences caused by chance? That sounds like Homestuck's motif-heavy plot. The game repeats over and over. The callbacks repeat over and over. The timelines that are tangled in on themselves, from the scratch to John's retcon to the Game Over timeline, matter partly because of the way they are different from one another. We understand both Dirk and Bro, or Rose and Alpha Rose, better for knowing who else they could have been. But those differences are produced by chance. John uses the power of the Blue House plot hole to literally destabilize the comic. He changes previous panels and creates new linked pathways, which are significant partly for how they diverge from the previous version of events. On a more tangible level, even before they started really playing with multiple panels, The Homestuck flashes are a very literal heap of fragments. The brief wordless clips contrast things that are happening in different times and different universes. The fragments are all piled together and then rushed through. To understand the longer flashes properly, you have to watch them several times. You have to find a way to absorb all of the densely packed information that only matters as a whole event. In the lead-up to Cascade, Doc Scratch explains that the fragments of Homestuck's story are tightly wound together, no matter how disparate they are in dimension or time. The two heroes of light had challenged the same Jack Noir, the one straddling the Scratch and about 20 hours of his own time, to a circumstantially simultaneous pair of duels. Circumstantial simultaneity is a concept more complex than its temporal analog, and is valuable for examining the properties of paradox space. He insists that mortals cannot really understand circumstantial simultaneity, and therefore he will not bother to explain it further. Obviously, in one sense it's just a silly phrase Andrew Hussie made up, but in another sense, it strongly resembles Jameson's ideas about ideal postmodern viewership. Events separated in both time and content nevertheless gain meaning by being observed together, because of the ways they differ or diverge. Now, throughout this series, I'm not just using Homestuck as a repository of examples. Homestuck consistently incorporates and illustrates some diverse critical ideas about postmodernism, but it almost never has the same emotional perspective on those ideas as the critics who originally proposed them. Instead of being alarmed at a new cultural or psychological state of affairs, Homestuck is comfortable with the postmodern legacy. Homestuck grew up in the house that postmodernism built. And Homestuck, for all its apocalyptic imagery, is optimistic about building a future with the tools that postmodernism gives us. Spade's Slick uses depthlessness as a key to freedom from Lord English's vault. Homestuck as a comic uses playful pastiche to do the supposedly impossible, and build its own joking style partly out of fragments of previous work. The short video clips use their rapid editing, visually dense information, and inflexible pace to deliver a powerful narrative and emotional catharsis after thousands of pages of meandering text. And as for the cultural pathology that Jameson warns us about, Homestuck treats fragmentation as an opportunity as well as a hazard. Dirk's splintered existence is sometimes painful and dangerous, but it also allows him to accomplish things he wouldn't be able to otherwise. In Dirk Synchronize and Dirk Unite, despite those verbs, the autoresponder is not reintegrated with Dirk's identity. Nevertheless, his participation is essential to the safe entrance of the Alpha Kids into their session. At the climax of the story, Terezi deliberately uses the fragmentation of all the doomed timelines to achieve a measure of personal peace. Fixing the past into a single successful timeline couldn't heal her depression or her insecurity, but by using her abilities as seer of mind to access all the disparate possible Terezis in paradox space, she gains a richer understanding of herself, her choices, and her priorities than she ever could have otherwise. Terezi, remember, emphasizes that it is the diversity of lives, perspectives, and possibilities Terezi finds in her alternate fragments that offer her a way to move forward. Terezi doesn't fuse into one true ultimate Terezi, but by embracing the fragmentation of her branching paths, she gains new knowledge and new points of view that help her to forgive and accept herself, something she struggled with for the entire comic. These sequences suggest that fragmentation, even without reintegration, can be recuperated and recuperative. Fragmentation might literally mean brokenness into multiple surfaces, splinters, or parts, but that multiplicity can be transmuted into a source of strength, or even a saving grace. Thanks for listening to all that. Next time, we'll be talking about Jean-François Lyotard and narratives of legitimation, or how do we agree on what we believe? Spoilers, it's kind of hard.